Welcome to Nightfall Sleep Radio. Tonight, we go back in time to explore the myths and legends of ancient Greece and Rome, as presented by the author and historian E.M. Berens in his book from 1880. We begin our story with the first dynasty, the origin of the world, and we will continue through the second dynasty, which introduces the concept of time, the division of the world, and the theories on the origin of man. If you enjoy these soft-spoken bedtime stories, please consider subscribing to ensure you never miss an upload. Now let's get started with the origin of the world. The ancient Greeks had several different theories with regard to the origin of the world, but the generally accepted notion was that before this world came into existence, there was in its place a confused mass of shapeless elements called chaos. These elements, becoming at length consolidated, by what means does not appear, resolved themselves into two widely different substances, the lighter portion of which, soaring on high, formed the sky or firmament, and constituted itself into a vast overarching vault which protected the firm and solid mass beneath. Thus came into being the two first great primeval deities of the Greeks, Uranus and Ge or Gaia. Uranus, the more refined deity, represented the light and air of heaven, possessing the distinguishing qualities of light, heat, purity, and omnipresence, whilst Gaia, the firm, flat, life-sustaining earth, was worshipped as the great, all-nourishing mother. Her many titles refer to her more or less in this character, and she appears to have been universally revered among the Greeks, there being scarcely a city in Greece which did not contain a temple erected in her honor. Indeed, Gaia was held in such veneration that her name was always invoked whenever the gods took a solemn oath, made an emphatic declaration, or implored assistance. Uranus, the heaven, was believed to have united himself in marriage with Gaia, the earth, and a moment's reflection will show what a truly poetical and also what a logical idea this was. For taken in a figurative sense, this union actually does exist. The smiles of heaven produce the flowers of earth, whereas this long-continued frowns exercise so depressing an influence upon his loving partner that she no longer decks herself in bright and festive robes, but responds with ready sympathy to his melancholy mood. The firstborn child of Uranus and Gaia was Oceanus, the ocean stream, that vast expanse of ever-flowing water which encircled the earth. Here we meet with another logical, though fanciful conclusion, which a very slight knowledge of the workings of nature proves to have been just and true. The ocean is formed from the rains which descend from heaven and the streams which flow from the earth. By making Oceanus, therefore, the offspring of Uranus and Gaia, the ancients, if we take this notion in its literal sense, merely assert that the ocean is produced by the combined influence of heaven and earth, whilst at the same time their fervid and poetical imagination led them to see in this, as in all manifestations of the powers of nature, an actual, tangible divinity. But Uranus, the heaven, the embodiment of light, heat, and the breath of life, produced offspring who were of a much less material nature than his son Oceanus. These other children of his were supposed to occupy the intermediate space which divided him from Gaia. Nearest to Uranus, and just beneath him, came Ether, a bright creation representing that highly rarefied atmosphere which immortals alone could breathe. Then followed air, which was in close proximity to Gaia, and represented, as its name applies, the grosser atmosphere surrounding the earth, which mortals can freely breathe, and without which they would perish. Ether and air were separated from each other by divinities called Nephile. These were their restless and wandering sisters, who existed in the form of clouds, ever floating between ether and air. Gaia also produced the mountains, and Pontus the sea. She united herself with the latter, and their offspring were the sea deities Nereus, Thaumas, Porses, Ceto, and Eurybia. Coexistent with Uranus and Gaia were two mighty powers who were also the offspring of chaos. They were the Erebus, or darkness, and Nyx, night, who formed a striking contrast to the cheerful light of heaven and the bright smiles of earth. Erebus reigned in that mysterious world below, where no ray of sunshine, no gleam of daylight, nor vestige of health-giving terrestrial life ever appeared. And Nyx, the sister of Erebus, represented night and was worshipped by the ancients with the greatest solemnity. Uranus was also supposed to have been united to Nyx, but only in his capacity as god of light, he being considered the source and fountain of all light, and their children were Aurora, the dawn, and Hemera, the daylight. Nyx, again, on her side, was also doubly united, having been married to some indefinite period to Erebus. In addition to those children of heaven and earth already enumerated, Uranus and Gaia produced two distinctly different races of beings called giants and titans. The giants personified brute strength alone, but the titans united to their great physical power intellectual qualifications. There were three giants, Briareus, Codus, and Gyges, who each possessed 100 hands and 50 heads, and were known collectively by the name of the Hectoshears, which signified 100-handed. These mighty giants could shake the universe and produce earthquakes. It is therefore evident that they represented those active subterranean forces to which allusion has been made in the opening chapter. The Titans were 12 in number, and their names were Oceanus, Ceos, Crios, Hyperion, Iapetus, Cronus, Thea, Rhea, Themis, Numensione, Phoebe, and Tyves. Now Uranus, the chaste light of heaven, the essence of all that is bright and pleasing, held in abhorrence his crude, rough, and turbulent offspring, the giants, and moreover feared that their great power might eventually prove hurtful to himself. He therefore hurled them into Tartarus, that portion of the lower world which served as a subterranean dungeon of the gods. In order to avenge the oppression of her children, the giants, Gaia instigated a conspiracy on the part of the Titans against Uranus, which was carried out to a successful issue by her son Cronus. He wounded his father, and from the blood of the wound which fell upon the earth sprang a race of monstrous beings, also called giants. Assisted by his brother Titans, Cronus succeeded in dethroning his father, who, enraged at his defeat, cursed his rebellious son and foretold to him a similar fate. Cronus now became invested with supreme power and assigned to his brothers offices of distinction, subordinate only to himself. Subsequently, however, when secure of his position, he no longer needed their assistance. He barely repaid their former services. With treachery, he made war upon his brothers and faithful allies, and assisted by the giants, completely defeated them, sending such as resisted his all-conquering arm down into the lowest depths of Tartarus. The Second Dynasty. Cronus was the god of time in its sense of eternal duration. He married Rhea, daughter of Uranus and Gaia, a very important divinity to whom a special chapter will be devoted hereafter. Their children were 3 sons, Aedes, also known as Pluto, Poseidon, who was also known as Neptune, Zeus, also known as Jupiter, and 3 daughters, Hestia, or Vesta, Demeter, also known as Ceres, and Hera, also known as Juno. Cronus, having an uneasy conscience, was afraid that his children might one day rise up against his authority and thus verify the prediction of his father Uranus. In order, therefore, to render the prophecy impossible of fulfillment, Cronus swallowed each child as soon as it was born, greatly to the sorrow and indignation of his wife Rhea. When it came to Zeus, the 6th and last, Rhea resolved to try and save this one child at least, to love and cherish, and appealed to her parents Uranus and Gaia for counsel and assistance. By their advice, she wrapped a stone in baby clothes, and Cronus in eager haste swallowed it without noticing the deception. The child, thus saved, eventually, as we shall see, dethroned his father Cronus, became supreme god in his stead, and was universally venerated as the great national god of the Greeks. Anxious to preserve the secret of his existence from Cronus, Rhea sent the infant Zeus secretly to Crete, where he was nourished, protected, and educated. A sacred goat, called Amalthea, supplied the place of his mother by providing him milk, and nymphs, called Melissae, fed him with honey, and eagles and doves brought him nectar and ambrosia. He was kept concealed in a cave in the heart of Mount Ida, and the Curetes, or priests of Rhea, by beating their shields together, kept up a constant noise at the entrance, which drowned out the cries of the child and frightened away all intruders. Under the watchful care of the nymphs, the infant Zeus throve rapidly, developing great physical powers, combined with extraordinary wisdom and intelligence. Grown to manhood, he determined to compel his father to restore his brothers and sisters to the light of day, and it is said to have been assisted in this difficult task by the goddess Metis, who artfully persuaded Cronus to drink a potion which caused him to give back the children he had swallowed. The stone which had counterfeited Zeus was placed at Delphi, where it was long exhibited as a sacred relic. Cronus was so enraged at being circumvented that war between the father and son became inevitable. The rival forces ranged themselves on 2 separate high mountains on Thelassay. Zeus, with his brothers and sisters, took his stand on Mount Olympus, where he was joined by Oceanus and others of the Titans who had forsaken Cronus on account of his oppressions. Cronus and his brother Titans took possession of Mount Othrys and prepared for battle. The struggle was long and fierce, and at length Zeus, finding that he was no nearer victory than before, bethought himself of the existence of the imprisoned giants, and knowing that they would be able to render him the most powerful assistance, he hastened to liberate them. He also called to his aid the Cyclops, sons of Poseidon and Amphitrite, who had only 1 eye each in the middle of their foreheads, and they were called Brontes, or thunder, Stereops, or lightning, and Prysmion, or fire anvil. They promptly responded to his summons for help, and brought with them tremendous thunderbolts, which the Hecatomcheires, with their 100 hands, hurled down upon the enemy, at the same time rising mighty earthquakes, which swallowed up and destroyed all who opposed them. Aided by these new and powerful allies, Zeus now made a furious onslaught of his enemies, and so tremendous was the encounter that all nature is said to have throbbed in accord with his mighty effort of the celestial deities. The sea rose mountain high, and its angry billows hissed and foamed. The earth shook to its foundations. The heavens sent forth rolling thunder and flash after flash of death-bringing lightning, whilst a blinding mist enveloped Cronus and his allies. And now the fortunes of war began to turn, and victory smiled on Zeus. Cronus and his army were completely overthrown, his brothers dispatched to the gloomy depths of the lower world, and Cronus himself was banished from his kingdom and deprived forever having the supreme power, which now became vested in his son Zeus. This war was called the Titanomachia, and is most graphically described by the old classic poets. With the defeat of Cronus and his banishment from his dominions, his career as a ruling Greek divinity entirely ceases. But being, like all gods, immortal, he was supposed to be still in existence, although possessing no longer either influence or authority, his place being filled to a certain extent by his descendant and successor, Zeus. Cronus is often represented as an old man leaning on a scythe with an hourglass in his hand. The hourglass symbolizes the fast fleeting moments as they succeed each other unceasingly. The scythe is emblematical of time, which mows down all before it. Saturn. The Romans, according to their custom of identifying their deities with those of the Greek gods whose attributes were similar to their own, declared Cronus to be identical with their old agricultural divinity Saturn. They believed that after his defeat in the Titanomachia and his banishment from the dominions by Zeus, he took refuge with Janus, king of Italy, who received the exiled deity with great kindness and even shared his throne with him. Their united reign became so thoroughly peaceful and happy, and was distinguished by such uninterrupted prosperity, that it was called the Golden Age. Saturn is usually represented bearing a sickle in one hand and a wheat sheaf in the other. A temple was erected to him at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, in which are deposited the public treasury and the laws of the state. Rhea. Rhea, the wife of Cronus and the mother of Zeus and the other gods of Olympus, personified the earth and was regarded as the great mother and unceasing producer of all plant life. She was also believed to exercise unbounded sway over the animal creation, more especially over the lion, the noble king of beasts. Rhea is generally represented wearing a crown of turrets or towers and seated on a throne, with lions crouching at her feet. She is sometimes depicted sitting on a chariot drawn by lions. The principal seat of her worship, which was always a very riotous character, was at Crete. At her festivals, which took place at night, the wildest music of flutes, cymbals, and drums resounded, while joyful shouts and cries, accompanied by dancing and loud stamping of feet, filled the air. This divinity was introduced into Crete by its first colonists from Pygea in Asia Minor, in which country she was worshipped under the name of Sibyl. The people of Crete adored her as the Great Mother, more specifically in her signification as the sustainer of the vegetable world. Seeing, however, that year by year, as winter appears, all her glory vanishes, her flowers fade, and her trees become leafless, they poetically expressed this process of nature under the figure of a lost love. She was said to have been tenderly attached to a youth of remarkable beauty named Attis, who, to her grief and indignation, proved faithless to her. He was about to unite himself to a nymph named Sagaris, when, in the midst of the wedding feast, the rage of the incensed goddess suddenly burst forth upon all present. A panic seized the assembled guests, and Attis, becoming afflicted with temporary madness, fled to the mountains and destroyed himself. Sibyl, moved with sorrow and regret, instituted a yearly mourning for his loss, when her priests, the Corybantes, with their usual noisy accompaniments, marched into the mountains to seek the lost youth. Having discovered him, they gave full vent to their ecstatic delight by indulging in the most violent gesticulations, dancing, shouting, and at the same time wounding and gashing themselves in a frightful manner. In Rome, the Greek Rhea was identified with Ops, the goddess of plenty, the wife of Saturn, who had a variety of appellations. She was called Magna Mater, Mater Deorum, Beresia Idea, and also Dindamine. This latter title she acquired from 3 high mountains in Phrygia, whence she was brought to Rome as Sibyl during the Second Punic War in BC 205, in obedience to an injunction contained in the Sibylline books. She was represented as a matron crowned with towers, seated in a chariot drawn by lions. The division of the world. We will now return to Zeus and his brothers, who, having gained a complete victory over their enemies, began to consider how the world which they had conquered should be divided between them. At last it was settled by lot that Zeus should reign supreme in heaven, while Hades governed the lower world, and Poseidon had full command over the sea. But the supremacy of Zeus was recognized in all 3 kingdoms, in heaven, on earth, in which of course the sea was included, and under the earth. Zeus held his court on top of Mount Olympus, whose summit was beyond the clouds. The dominions of Hades were the gloomy unknown regions below the earth, and Poseidon reigned over the sea. It will be seen that the realm of each of these gods was enveloped in mystery. Olympus was shrouded in mists, Hades was wrapped in gloomy darkness, and the sea was, and indeed still is, a source of wonder and deep interest. Hence we see that what to other nations were merely strange phenomena served this poetical and imaginative people as a foundation upon which to build the wonderful stories of their mythology. The division of the world now being satisfactorily arranged, it would seem that all things ought to have gone smoothly. But such was not the case. Trouble arose in an unlooked-for quarter. The giants, those hideous monsters, some with legs formed of serpents, who had sprung from the earth and the blood of Uranus, declared war against the triumphant deities of Olympus, and a struggle ensued, which in consequence of Gaia having made these children of hers invincible as long as they kept their feet on the ground, was wearisome and protracted. Their mother's precaution, however, was rendered unavailing by pieces of rock being hurled upon them, which threw them down, and their feet, being no longer placed firmly on the Mother Earth, could be overcome, and this tedious war, which was called the Gigantomachia, at last came to an end. Among the most daring of those earth-born giants were Encladius, Rhodus, and the valiant Mimas, who with youthful fire and energy hurled against heaven great masses of rock and burning oak trees, and defied the lightnings of Zeus. One of the most powerful monsters who opposed Zeus in this war was called Typhon, or Typhonus. He was the youngest son of Tartarus and Gaia, and had 100 heads, with eyes which struck terror to the beholders, and awe-inspiring voices frightful to hear. This dreadful monster resolved to conquer both gods and men, but his plans were at length defeated by Zeus, who after a violent encounter succeeded in destroying him with a thunderbolt. But not before he had so terrified the gods that they had fled for refuge to Egypt, where they metamorphosed themselves into different animals and thus escaped. Theories as to the origin of man. Just as there were several theories concerning the origin of the world, so there were various accounts of the creation of man. The first natural belief of the Greek people was that man had sprung from the earth. They saw the tender plants and flowers force their way through the ground in the early spring of the year after the frost of winter had disappeared. And so they naturally concluded that man must also have issued from the earth in a similar manner. Like the wild plants and flowers, he was supposed to have had no cultivation, and resembled in his habits the untamed beasts of the field, having no habitation except which nature had provided in the holes of rocks and the dense forests whose overarching boughs protected them from the inclemency of the weather. In the course of time, these primitive human beings became tamed and civilized by the gods and heroes who taught them to work in metals, to build houses and other useful arts of civilization. But the human race became, in the course of time, so degenerate that the gods resolved to destroy all mankind by means of a flood. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha, being on account of their piety the only mortals saved. By the command of his father, Deucalion built a ship in which he and his wife took refuge during the deluge, which lasted for 9 days. When the waters abated, the ship rested on Mount Othrys in Thessaly, or according to some, on Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and his wife now consulted the oracle of Themis as to how the human race might be restored. The answer was that they were to cover their heads and throw the bones of their mother behind them. For some time they were perplexed as to the meaning of the oracle command, but at length both agreed that by the bones of their mother were meant to be stones of the earth. They accordingly took up stones from the mountainside and cast them over their shoulders. From those thrown, there sprang up men, and from those thrown by Pyrrha, women. After the lapse of time, the theory of autogeny from autos, self, and chulon, earth, was laid aside. When this belief existed, there were no religious teachers whatever. But in course of time, temples were raised in honor of different gods, and priests appointed to offer sacrifices to them and conduct their worship. These priests were looked upon as authorities in all religious matters, and the doctrine they taught was that man had been created by the gods, and that there had been several successive ages of men, which were called the Golden, Silver, Brazen, and Iron Ages. Life in the Golden Age was one unceasing round of ever-recurring pleasures, unmarred by sorrow or care. The favored mortals living at this happy time led pure and joyous lives, thinking no evil and doing no wrong. The earth brought forth fruits and flowers without toil or labor, in plentiful luxuriance, and war was unknown. This delightful and godlike existence lasted for hundreds of years, and when at length life on earth was ended, death laid his hand so gently upon them that they passed painlessly away in a happy dream and continued their existence as ministering spirits in Hades, watching over and protecting those they had loved and left behind on earth. The men of the Silver Age were a long time growing up, and during their childhood, which lasted 100 years, they suffered from ill health and extreme debility. When they at last became men, they lived but a short time, for they would not abstain from mutual injury, nor pay the service due to the gods, and they were therefore banished to Hades. There, unlike the beings of the Golden Age, they exercised no beneficent supervision over the dear ones left behind. They wandered about as restless spirits, always sighing for the lost pleasures they had enjoyed in life. The men of the Brazen Age were quite a different race of beings, being as strong and powerful as those of the Silver Age were weak and enervated. Everything which surrounded them was of brass, their arms, their tools, their dwellings, and all that they made. Their characters seemed to have resembled the metal in which they delighted. Their minds and hearts were hard, obdurate, and cruel. They led a life of strife and contention, introduced into the world which had hitherto known nothing but peace and tranquility, the scourge of war, and were in fact only happy when fighting or quarreling with each other. Hitherto Themis, the god of justice, had been living among mankind, but becoming disheartened at their evil doings, she abandoned the earth and winged her flight back to heaven. At last, the gods became so tired of their evil deeds and continual dissensions that they removed them from the face of the earth and sent them down to Hades to share the fate of their predecessors. We now come to the men of the Iron Age. The earth, no longer teeming with fruitfulness, only yielded her increase after much toil and labor. The goddess Justice, having abandoned mankind, no influence remained sufficiently powerful to preserve them from every kind of wickedness and sin. This condition grew worse as time went on, until at last Zeus, in his anger, let loose the water courses from above and drowned every individual of this evil race, except Deucalion, and Pyrrha. The theory of Hesiod, the oldest of all the Greek poets, was that the Titan Prometheus, son of Hippotas, had formed man out of clay, and that Athena had breathed a soul into him. Full of love for the beings he called into existence, Prometheus determined to elevate their minds and improve their condition in every way. He therefore taught them astronomy, mathematics, the alphabet, how to cure diseases, and the art of divination. He created this race in such great numbers that the gods began to see the necessity of instituting certain fixed laws with regard to the sacrifices due them and the worship to which they considered themselves entitled from mankind in return for the protection which they accorded them. An assembly was therefore convened at Macon in order to settle these points. It was decided that Prometheus, as the advocate of man, should slay an ox, which should be divided into 2 equal parts, and that the gods should select one portion, which should be henceforth in all future sacrifices to be set apart for them. Prometheus so divided the ox that one part consisted of the bones, which formed, of course, the least valuable portion of the animal, artfully concealed by white fat, whilst the other contained all the edible parts, which he covered with the skin, and on top of all he laid the stomach. Zeus, pretending to be deceived, chose the heap of bones, but he saw through the stratagem, and was so angry at the deception practiced on him by Prometheus that he avenged himself by refusing the mortals the gift of fire. Prometheus, however, resolved to brave the anger of the great ruler of Olympus and to obtain from heaven the vital spark so necessary for the further progress and comfort of the human race. He accordingly contrived to steal some sparks from the chariot of the sun, which he conveyed to earth hidden in a hollow tube. Furious at being again outwitted, Zeus determined to be revenged, first on mankind and then on Prometheus. To punish the former, he commanded Hephaestus, or Vulcan, to mold a beautiful woman out of clay, and determined that through her instrumentality, trouble and misery should be brought into the world. The gods were so charmed with the graceful and artistic creation of Hephaestus that they all determined to endow her with some special gift. Hermes, or Mercury, bestowed on her a smooth and persuasive tongue. Aphrodite gave her beauty and the art of pleasing. The Graces made her fascinating, and Athena, or Minerva, gifted her with the possession of feminine accomplishments. She was called Pandora, which means all gifted, having received every attribute necessary to make her charming and irresistible. Thus beautifully formed and endowed, this exquisite creature, attired by the Graces and crowned with the flowers by the seasons, was conducted to the house of Epimetheus by Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Now Epimetheus had been warned by his brother not to accept any gift whatever from the gods. But he was so fascinated by this beautiful being who suddenly appeared before him that he welcomed her into his home and made her his wife. It was not long, however, before he had cause to regret his weakness. He had in his possession a jar of rare workmanship, consisting all the blessings reserved by the gods for mankind, which he had been expressly forbidden to open. But woman's proverbial curiosity could not withstand so great a temptation, and Pandora determined to solve the mystery at any cost. Watching her opportunity, she raised the lid, and immediately all the blessings which the gods had thus reserved for mankind took wing and flew away. But all was not lost. Just as hope, which lay at the bottom, was about to escape, Pandora hastily closed the lid of the jar, and thus preserved to man that never-failing solace which helps him to bear with courage the many ills which assail him. Having punished mankind, Zeus determined to execute vengeance on Prometheus. He accordingly chained him to a rock on Mount Caucasus and sent an eagle every day to gnaw away his liver, which grew again every night, ready for fresh torment. For 30 years Prometheus endured this fearful punishment, but at length Zeus relented and permitted his son Heracles, or Hercules, to kill the eagle, and the sufferer was released. That's the end of the second dynasty of the Olympian divinities. I hope you've enjoyed the story, and you'll join us again for the next installment. Good night, and sleep well.